Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Creative Theology, where we discuss the arts, beauty, and creativity, all from a scriptural point of view. And, as we're getting this podcast off the ground, would love and appreciate sharing with your friends, giving it a like, giving it a subscribe, all that fun stuff, just to help us spread the idea, the amazing idea that beauty and creativity and artistry are actually central themes in Scripture and not some weird niche idea, but actually speaks to the very nature of God and our nature as well. So it's a worthwhile mission and definitely an incredible lens to look at the Bible through and study the Bible through, which is what we're doing on this podcast. So today, I want to mention one of my favorite liturgical refrains or acclamations, and it's this: Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. I love to say that in the liturgy. If you're part of a liturgical church, you very well may say that as part of your worship. I've written music to it. I just love that refrain. Now, this past, present, and future idea, it's a central sequence of our theological thought into our faith. And so today I want to introduce a variant. And this variant, it's something I say sometimes, and it might stretch your imagination, your mind a little bit, but I got lots of scripture to back it up. So let's go for it. So Christ has created, Christ is creating, Christ will create again. Christ has created, Christ is creating, Christ will create again. Let's unpack it from the scripture. I have a lot of scripture to share with you. So some I'll mention, some we'll read. And so let's start with the first part of this refrain. Christ has created. So obviously, we know if you're just starting at the beginning, Genesis 1 and 2, we see God creating the heavens and the earth. And we learn in the New Testament that, let's start with John 1. So John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So Christ was not only present at creation, he was the agent of creation. How that works, I don't totally understand. We can use our imagination, but somehow Christ was the agent of creation. And another verse that backs that up, check this out, 1 Corinthians 16, talking of Christ. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. So this is the idea that Christ has created all things in heaven and on earth. Now, for the earth, yeah, we know, every Christian, believes that God created, or every Christian should believe that God created the earth. Now, I want us to think about this because there's this obscure verse that we often pass over in Job 38. Now, you don't usually want to build a theology around Job because as you read Job, you realize at the end that God just kind of takes everyone to task who's talking a whole lot in Job. I mean, there's this chapter after chapter of people talking, and so many of them are way off. And God comes in at the end and just corrects everybody, just lays the smack down, which is awesome. And so you don't always want to build a theology based on what you find in Job. However, in Job 38, God is talking and he says this, and this is where we can build a theology around it because God is saying this in Job. Part of God's big rebuke. He says this, Job 38, 4-7, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. This is the picture God is giving us, that when the earth was created, the angels were already there. The angels were already there. They were celebrating. The heavenly host was celebrating and shouting as the earth was being created. What does that mean? That means that the angels were created first. So the earth and humans is not the origin point of God's creative work. there was a point before that where God created, what does Genesis 1 start with? God created the heavens and the earth. Now, when you think about heaven, obviously sometimes, in our thought about heaven, we just think of like this cerebral, mystical, spiritual, like invisible, floating on a cloud, like no substance to heaven. But Scripture paints a very different picture. Scripture tells us that the heavens have buildings and structures from multiple times. I mean, you see in Hebrews 8 that the author of Hebrews says that like the tabernacle was made from a copy. It's a copy of the heavenly realities. I mean, you have so many scriptures about structures in heaven. The mansions, the rooms that Jesus talks about the Father creating. And you see it in Exodus 2 when Moses is on the mountain with God, and God's like, "Let me show you the heavenly tabernacle." The heavenly tabernacle, and you're going to recreate that on earth. That's the shadow of what was created. So heaven has structures and buildings in rooms. Heaven has vehicles. Have you thought about this? There's multiple times that heavenly vehicles come and actually are seen with substance. I mean, one actually takes Elijah away. It's this flaming chariot. Well, we know it's, where did that come from? It was from heaven. It was a transported vehicle. It was physical because it took a human, which means heaven has vehicles. Heaven has weapons. I mean, there was a war in heaven. The angel of the Lord has a sword. Heaven has food. I mean, Scripture talks about the bread of angels. We talk about the marriage supper of the Lamb. So all these things, I'm saying all this because heaven has substance, which means heaven has building materials. The heavens is not just some mystical, cerebral kind of idea. It has substance to it, which means there's a creative culture in heaven. These things have to be made. They have to be built. The bread, needs to be baked. The buildings need to be constructed. I don't know if we fully understand this, except this idea that Christ has created all things in heaven and on earth. And there was this past tense of, yes, those things were created, but we don't stop there. Now, a lot of times we think about this, that creativity, that God's creativity was a singular act, and it happened in Genesis 1 and 2, and then, okay, that's over. That is not the thread of Scripture. That is not what we learn about God's creative nature. See, if you've been listening to this podcast, one of my central theses of this idea that God is creator by nature, not just by function, which means it's not just something he does, it's who he is. And we often think of it just in functional terms, that there was a task that needed done, and God's already done that, and now he's moved on. But when something is in your nature, you keep doing it. You almost can't help yourself. And we see this with God creating. So let's move on to Christ is creating. There's a present tense to Christ creating. And I think the clearest picture we have of this is 1 Peter 2, 4-5. Let me pull this up. So 1 Peter 2, 4-5 says this: "As you come to him," Christ, "a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." So Peter's giving us a picture that there is this present tense of God fitting people together. Us, we're the material in this picture. God is using us, his people, as living stones, as the material for the structure that he is building. That there is this present tense of God fitting together. Now, I think we often feel this in our spiritual lives, don't we? That God sometimes is like picks us up and moves us somewhere else and places us somewhere else, and all of a sudden we're fit together, like feeling like where we should. There is this present tense of God building something, and we don't see the full blueprint because we're just part of it. We're one of the living stones, and this is, I think, one of the main parts of God's present tense in creating. In real time, right now, he is creating a spiritual house with us, material. Now, there's also, we talked about it earlier, this verse in Colossians 1, 16 to 17, about there is a part of creativity that is sustaining. And we learn from Scripture, not just in Colossians 1, but also in Hebrews 1, that Christ sustains all things. All things are held together by him. There is this present act of holding all things together, making sure everything keeps going, keeps working, like the problems get solved, and the problems, not that God created the problems, but the problems that sin and, corrupt human nature introduces into creation. Christ is actively working to fix those things and sustain his creation. And so there's this act of present tense of Christ is creating. Part of Christ creating in real time is also this idea of when someone gets totally saved and reborn, there's a new creation that we don't see with our physical eyes, but something actually happens in someone. In a lot of traditions, including mine, we look at that point at baptism. When someone is baptized, we don't necessarily see anything with our physical eyes, but we know that there's a new creation that happens, something we can't see, but it's new. There is a new creation that happens in that person through the sacrament of baptism, God's sovereign work of transforming someone and making them someone brand new, not just modifying or fixing, but making somebody new. There's this present act of creation. There's also this future creation that the Bible talks about. And I think there's two main points that the Bible talks about that. Now, this may sound weird, but one of my favorite things to do, honestly, is to preach at funerals. Not that I'm ever happy that somebody dies, but there is this opportunity at funerals to present and preach the gospel in ways that really can impact people. Let's be honest. If you're at a wedding, you don't remember the wedding sermon. No one's there to hear the preacher. But I learned that early on in pastoring. I got asked to do my first wedding, which was great. I was so happy for the people, but I was like, no one's here to hear the sermon. At funerals, though, people are wrestling with questions like, what happens when you die? Where is this person that I loved? And one of the passages that gets preached often at funerals and should be is 1 Corinthians 15. It's a very lengthy chapter. But I do want to read some of these verses because this speaks of Christ's future creation. Let's start at verse 39. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is of another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for stars differ from star in glory. And here it is. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. And going on here down a little bit, verse 51, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. There's this moment coming in the future where, here it is, we're going to get a new body, a heavenly body, with a glory that we can't really understand or comprehend yet. But God is going to create for us a new body. You're still going to be you. I'm still going to be me. I'm still going to have my weird sense of humor and my quirkiness, right? But I'm going to have a new body. I'm going to have a new heavenly body. There is this future act of creation where Christ will do this, and it will be when we are raised from the dead. One last one. This is probably my favorite. When we think of the end times, we think of Revelation. I think so much of like pop culture and movies, this is part of the power of the arts and media, have given us this view that the end of the story is us going up to heaven. And there we live forever. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story in Scripture, in Revelation 21, is that you have a heavenly city coming down to the earth. Now notice it's a heavenly city, which means it was built, it was created, right? But coming down to the earth. And then one of the biggest cliffhanger by far, Revelation 21, 1-5, Christ is speaking, and he says this. Well, first John says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." And so this is a new heaven and a new earth, something that's still yet to be created. God will create again. And this is the picture we have, verse 5. "And he who was seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.'" Christ will create again. There is a future creation coming. The end of the story is not us going up to the current heaven and leaving the earth. The end of the story is a cliffhanger where Christ is creating a new heaven and a new earth, and they're overlapped, they're merged, much like Eden and Genesis 1 and 2. And we're here on this new heaven and this new earth. We don't know what it's going to be like. I mean, Scripture says the sea is no more. I mean, you have this idea there's no sun. We don't know what this is going to be like. There's no, like, Christ is the light of this new place. We don't understand all the dynamics of this, except that it's going to be brand new. Going to be brand new, and we're going to be here for it. We're going to be here on this new heaven and the new earth that have overlapped, that have merged. And this is a great cliffhanger, that it's not the end of the story. Now, if we know that Christ is created, Christ is creating, Christ will create again, I don't think there's an end in sight. I think that Christ will be creating always, because it's his nature. It's who he is. It's not just a function. So when we read Scripture, we see from beginning to end that creativity is central to the plan and the work of God. It's not niche. It's not a one-time event. It's a thread. And we get to experience that. We get to live it, and we will experience it in the future. So I just want to encourage you, as you read Scripture, as you dive in, start to see this thread, and maybe even say this refrain with me. Make it part of your liturgy. That Christ has created, Christ is creating, Christ will create again. We'll talk a lot more about this in future episodes, but for now, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.